In this video, we are going to talk a little bit about essay writing. It's something I'm sure you've been doing since the beginning of high school, and you will certainly be an expert on it by the end of high school. But we're going to go through a few tips and tricks about essay structures, essay processes, and then just some general pointers that might help make this a more pleasant time for you while you are writing essays. First, this presentation is going to cover a little bit about the structure of an essay, everything you would find within an essay. So we'll cover introductions, body paragraphs, conclusions, and some of the more important elements of all of those. The second section of this presentation is going to talk about the essay writing process. So really how to write an essay, going from the very beginning when you're assigned the essay, when you're picking your topic, to when you're handing in your final draft at the very end. And the last few slides will just give you some helpful tips for the essay writing workflow, structuring your essay, and a few tips for formal writing as well. You may have seen this before, this diagram here, something that's known as the Hamburger Essay. You may have seen something similar with a hamburger paragraph. Essentially, the Hamburger Essay just shows you a very bare bones essay structure, the very basics of what every essay should have. Here, the top and bottom bun represent the introduction and conclusion, and the burger, lettuce, and tomato represent body paragraphs 1, 2, and 3. And this is sort of the minimum of everything you would want in an essay. You're welcome to add more toppings as needed if you need to add more body paragraphs to your essay, but chances are all the essays you're writing right now have 3 paragraphs or at least 3 paragraphs. You can also see a sort of different view of the essay structure here in this diagram. It gets a little bit more specific about the introduction and conclusion. So these are shaped as an inverted triangle and another triangle pointing up. At the top of the introduction, you're starting with a broad idea and bringing it to a narrow idea toward the end of an introduction, and a conclusion is pretty much the opposite, where you start your conclusion with a narrow idea and end on a broad idea. So here a broad idea is referring to anything really in relation to the real world, any sort of background information about your topic, any context you can provide that might make it easier for the reader to understand your essay. And a narrow idea is something like your own thesis, your argument in your essay, and then a preview in the introduction or a summary in the conclusion of the arguments in the body paragraphs of your essay. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of these when we're discussing components at length. So here's that same diagram of the introduction explained in a little bit more detail. Before looking at these elements, let's just review the purpose of an essay introduction. Primarily, an introduction serves as a preview of what the essay will be about. By the time someone has read your introduction, they really should have a good idea of what's coming in the essay. They'll know the argument, the overall thesis of the essay, and the smaller points you'll be making in each of your body paragraphs. The essay also serves as, or the introduction to the essay serves as a tool to grab your reader's attention. I know the teacher who will be reading your essay has to read your essay regardless, but you want to make the teacher want to read your essay and be very interested in what you have to say. So this is sort of the first element of an essay introduction, something to really grab the attention of the reader. So sometimes you might want to include an interesting quote, some sort of a statistic or a fact, an anecdote or a short story about something related to your topic, anything like that, just to get the reader a little bit hooked. Once you've started with an interesting hook, you'll want to explore a little bit of the context of your topic. So this is just some background information about the broad issue. If you're writing an English essay, it might be a brief explanation of a novel that you read that your essay will be about, something like title, author, main ideas, just to give the reader a little bit of an overview. Here you can also talk about what makes your topic interesting or important, really, again, connecting it back to the real world and why it's important enough to write about and why we should care about it in the world outside of your essay. Next, moving more toward the narrow idea, the bottom point of the triangle is your thesis statement. And your thesis is the overall argument you're making in your essay that we're going to connect all of our points in our body paragraphs back to. The final thing, it can be either a part of a thesis or just after your thesis, is a bit of an overview of the essay. Sometimes you'll hear this being called a roadmap, essentially giving you a preview of what each paragraph is going to be about. You should list the points that will be covered in your arguments. Let's go a little bit more in depth looking at the thesis statement. First of all, what is a thesis statement? Essentially, it's the central argument that your essay is making and the point that all of your body paragraphs are supporting. It also sometimes helps to think of your thesis as an answer to a question. And this question is either your research question or an essay question, which is assigned by the teacher or chosen by you. So if the teacher gives you a question asking you whether you agree or disagree with a certain point, your thesis would be the response as to whether you disagree and ideally, whether you agree or disagree, and ideally why as well. So for example, also if you're writing maybe a history essay, the essay question or research question might be something like, what was the most significant factor that led to the outbreak of World War I, and why do you think it's the most significant? So your thesis would ideally answer that question. So the answer could be something like, the most significant factor that led to the outbreak of World War I was nationalism, because it led to feelings of resentment in Europe, and this was backed by the buildup of military capabilities. Anything sort of like that, that answers your essay question or research question. There are sort of two ways to format a thesis, and we'll show some more detailed examples of these as well. The first type is a broad statement that summarizes the whole argument. And this is the kind of thesis that you really want to aim for. It shows a little bit more of a depth of analysis and shows that you've thought about the topic as a whole, as opposed to the second type of thesis, which is just listing your supporting arguments, essentially putting your roadmap as part of your thesis. Let's go over what makes a thesis good. A strong thesis, first and foremost, answers the question. You want something that's a direct response to your research question or the question that the teacher is asking you to address. You get a lot of points when writing essays just for following instructions. So a good thesis that answers the question it's supposed to answer will do just this. Next, your essay needs to take a clear position, especially like something where it's an agree or disagree question. You need to pick a side and you need to stick to it, and you need to argue that in the body of your essay. You can't really be flipping and flopping between both. The exception to that being if you want to explore a point from the other side and then try to disprove it in the paragraph after that as well. Another thing that makes a thesis statement strong is if it answers a why question or a how question. This makes your thesis a little bit more analytical. It often involves some deeper thinking than a what question, but you still can choose a what question. Oftentimes you can just sort of rephrase a what question into a why question or a how question. Really a why or a how question just shows a bit more relational thinking than a what question. So it's more likely to have a good logical flow through the body of an essay and not just a list of factors. So you want to see sort of how one factor in an essay affects another, something causes something else, and you'll get that really with a what or a why question. We'll look at this a little bit more with examples as well later on. The final point that can give you a strong thesis is picking a question or a thesis that is debatable. First of all, this just really makes an essay interesting. If you're arguing in favor of a fact, there's really nothing to argue. You want to argue something where there's more than one side, where someone could take a different position from you, and you could have a really interesting debate about that. So here's an example of some possible thesis statements. This is adapted from some of my own work from high school English class. We read the novel Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. If you haven't read it, this is sort of a dystopian science fiction novel about the dangers of excessive government and excessive government having control over society and the role that technology could possibly play in this. So potentially a research question about the novel Brave New World, or an essay question, might be, in the novel Brave New World, does technology have a positive or negative impact on the characters' lives? To answer this question with a thesis, you could do it in the sort of broad statement format and argue something like, in the novel Brave New World, technology has a negative impact on the characters because its inevitable failure causes widespread suffering. Or if you went more with the second format for a thesis, the list format, it might look like, in the novel Brave New World, technology has a negative impact on the characters because it is prone to failure, limits individuals mentally and physically, and leaves no room for individuality. So you can see there, it essentially just lists 3 reasons why technology has a negative impact on the characters, and those would correspond to each of your 3 body paragraphs. So prone to failure, limits individuals, and no room for individuality. So instead, what you could do is go with the first option, the broad statement, and then just include those more specific points in a roadmap instead of in your thesis. So they would still be in the introduction, but you would have a broader, more overarching thesis to summarize your argument. This is also an example of more of a what question and not really a why or a how question, but it still does show sort of a cause and effect relationship, looking here at the relationship between technology and suffering. And this is sort of an example of how a what question can be just as good for in-depth analysis as a why or a how question. You don't want a what question that's just sort of asking you about a fact. Next, let's look at writing body paragraphs for essays. Here, I'm demonstrating it with the C or SEE format. You've probably seen something similar. SEE stands for statement, example, explanation. You may have seen something like point, example, explanation, anything like this with these similar 3 elements. Regardless of which format you use, you should always start your body paragraphs with a topic sentence. So this will include the overall idea of the paragraph, and often here you're taking ideas right out of your roadmap. Just stating fairly plainly exactly what your argument is. Next is your statement, or what might also be called point. This is just a narrow point that the paragraph is arguing, and it's a little bit more specific than your topic sentence. And you're starting here to connect it to your example. So also if you are doing an English essay, this is where you'll introduce a little bit more about the text that you're reading as well. Following the statement is the example, which is a quotation or a statistic or a fact, anything you've gotten either out of your assigned text or out of your own research. And here it's very important to include the source of the speaker if it's applicable and make the appropriate citation. So you might have your in-text citation, you might have footnotes, endnotes, just depending on the style that your teacher wants you to use. After the example comes an explanation, and here you're making 2 connections. Here you're connecting the example to the argument of the paragraph, so to your statement, to your topic sentence, and you're also relating it back to the overall thesis. So how does this statement and this example support the argument of your essay? If you just did one round of statement, example, explanation, this might leave your paragraph a little bit too short. So I would say generally aim for at least 2 repetitions of this per paragraph, maybe up to 3 if it's a bit of a longer paragraph, but you would just add another statement, example, explanation. The final element of a body paragraph is the transition sentence. And this can offer a brief summary of the paragraph and link the ideas of this paragraph to the next one, really just for the flow of the paper. And here you'll want to use a lot of transition words. I'm sure you've seen these before and been told to use a lot of these. Anything like first, finally, additionally, evidently, consequently, similarly, in comparison. It's really all about making sense of things in a chronological way with words like first and finally, and also making connections between your points with words like similarly or in comparison. The final aspect of your essay will be the conclusion. This you'll see we have our triangle with the point facing up, the opposite of the introduction. You'll want to start with your narrow idea, which is your thesis, and end on a broad idea, which is your closing remarks. So the first thing you do in your conclusion is restate your thesis in slightly different words than you had it in your introduction. And I know this can be really hard for a lot of people since you spend so much time thinking about your thesis and coming up with the perfect thesis and relating all of your body paragraphs back to the thesis. So it can kind of just get stuck in your head. So what I like to do in order to restate the thesis is just look away from your essay, maybe close your eyes or turn off your computer and pretend someone is asking you, what does your essay argue? What's this all about? Think about what you would tell them in sort of plain, informal language. Write this down and you can rework it into more proper academic language if needed, but it does really help to get your original thesis out of your head and think about what you are arguing in other words. Next, you'll want to briefly summarize the points in your essay as well, just a quick recap of your arguments to remind the reader what they just read. Next, we're moving more into some of the broad ideas, and what you might want to include in your conclusion is something called implications. Implications are basically why your essay matters, and there are 2 different types of implications to look at. The first are academic implications. So why does this matter for you to learn about in school? Are there any topics that are closely related to your essay, but not necessarily included in it? Something maybe you touched on briefly in one paragraph, but you could write a whole separate essay about. Here, you're really just acknowledging that there are these other important points, but you haven't included them. Except here, try not to introduce too many new topics, just anything you've already covered in your essay. As well, you can explore whether your essay raises any more questions for future study. Sometimes less so in English, more in social sciences and history. You'll sort of learn something new and interesting and include it in your essay, and it'll give you way more ideas for different things to research and different things to learn about. So it's something you could potentially base a project off of in the future, and it can be really interesting and useful to acknowledge this in your essay. The second kind of implications are real-world implications. And here you want to ask yourself why these ideas are significant for the world that we live in. Why does it matter that you just talked about what started World War I? Why does it matter that you just talked about this Shakespeare essay or an element of it? What connections can you make to the world at large outside your essay? Lastly, you might want to include just some nice closing remarks. Some people like to end on a nice thought. Others like to really keep the reader thinking. You might be tempted to maybe ask a rhetorical question here. I would say try to stay away from that unless your teacher allows that specifically, because really you want to end with a conclusion. You want to end having argued something, having shared something with your reader. You don't want them to still be thinking like they don't have all the answers after they've read their essay. You can keep them thinking with a nice thought, but don't keep them thinking with more questions than they started with. All right. And this brings us to the second aspect of this presentation, which is an overview of the essay writing process. And just on the right-hand side here, we have a quick list of what will be included in this section. We'll start by looking at the essay topic and essay question, then a brief note on research, but we do have a separate video on research skills. I highly recommend checking that out for more detail. Next, we'll look at reviewing your notes and the brainstorming process as you come into developing a thesis. Once you have a thesis, you will work on your outline, and then it's time to draft and edit, and draft and edit as many times as you need to get your essay where it needs to be for its final submission. Step one is choosing your essay topic and choosing your question. The very first thing to do with any assignment you get is just to read it over and get a really strong sense of what your teacher is asking you to do. You'll also want to read the rubric if it's included, because this will let you know exactly what the teacher expects of you and if there are any special things you need to include in your essay for marks as well. In terms of the essay topic in question, a lot of the time this is assigned by your teacher, or occasionally you might have to produce your own. So if you are coming up with your own essay topic and your own essay question, it can be helpful to think about the class material. So thinking about what have you learned in the class so far, what themes and topics are important to this class. So again, maybe you're in a history class and you've learned a lot about World War I and the causes. So you might want to come up with a question that allows for a debate over maybe what caused World War I, what argument about these causes is most convincing. And instead of asking it sort of what caused World War I, you could almost rephrase this as a why question as well. Something like, why did World War I start when it did? And there you go, you have a question that builds off class material and is a why question that now allows for a really interesting analysis. If you're still having some trouble coming up with an essay topic or an essay question, you can do some research before you start, just to learn what's out there, if there are any elements to the class or the topic that you haven't really thought about so far. It's important to not use Wikipedia as an actual source for your essay, but it can be a really good jumping off point or just for inspiration for what you might want to read about. And also Wikipedia is a good resource to access other sources. You'll see you can click on the footnotes in Wikipedia or the superscript that leads you to the footnotes in Wikipedia and has links at the bottom to all of the other sources where people get their information to put on Wikipedia. And some of those can be completely legitimate sources, just as long as you're not using Wikipedia itself. All right. The next step in your essay writing project is research. Research, we do have another presentation on research skills, but very briefly, a few things to mention about research. The first thing you want to do is find your sources. I recommend starting with school sources or anywhere your teacher directs you specifically. You can also access other online and print sources like magazine articles and newspaper articles. And lastly, maybe when you're getting closer to grade 12, the end of high school, you might be introduced to academic journals as well. This is where professional academics put their work. It's all peer reviewed, it's all totally legitimate information, and it's all basically just other people's essays that are arguing sort of just like yours are, and you can take ideas from them as well. Once you've found all your sources, you'll want to take notes. Taking detailed notes is a really great idea. You're getting a lot of the hard stuff out of the way at the beginning, and the more detailed your notes are, the easier of a time you'll have putting your essay together and then perfecting it toward the end. So you might want to take some notes, including the title of the source, the author of the source, copy and paste the web link so you can find it again later. You might even want to put the full citation in your essay notes, and that way you won't have to go back through all your notes and all your web links and find it again later. You'll just have it ready to go when you're putting together your citations page. It's a good idea to just take point form notes and paraphrase information, put it all in your own words, except for a few significant quotations. This can be really helpful if you're writing an English essay as well, and you want to take some great quotations out of the text you're reading to use as evidence in your essay. The next step is reviewing all your notes and brainstorming some ideas for your essay. So the first step here is just read through your notes to refresh your memory on what you've learned. Think about what you have lots of information about, what's coming up over and over again in your research, and what are you missing? What do you maybe want to learn more about? And at this stage, you can always go back and do some more research if you need to, check out a few more sources, go over the ones you have already. Once you're satisfied that you have a good amount of research to write your essay, you'll want to organize your notes. So you can do things like color coding with a highlighter. You can cut and paste your notes into different categories, and these categories can become the basis of your paragraphs. So you'll notice maybe you have, again, if you're writing an essay about World War I and its causes, you might have a ton of information about the impact of militarism. So you'll highlight these all red. You might have a ton of information about the role of alliances in Europe, and you'll color these yellow. You might have a lot of information about imperialism, and you'll highlight this green, and you'll see these categories start to come together, and you can have a paragraph about each one. And as you're doing this, you'll want to start thinking about your thesis as well. Again, seeing what comes up over and over again in your research, what other academics think is important, and see what could possibly be made into an argument here. Let's look a little more specifically about the thesis. The most important thing to remember with a thesis is that you can't write a thesis before you research or before you read. A lot of people, especially people who love writing essays, are so excited just to sit down, get out their computer, get out a piece of paper, and get started right on the body paragraphs and go through it as quickly as they can. Except you really need to take a step back and slow down a little bit and really base your thesis on what you've read. So the thesis statement has to be an argument based on your source material, whether this is research you've done online or reading you've done from a text in class. When you're coming up with your thesis as well, you'll also want to refer to your research question. Just as a reminder, your thesis should answer the research question. So this will give you a little bit of direction as to where to go with your thesis. Here, you'll want to read over your notes again as well and see what answer to your question your research points you towards, since your thesis and all of your arguments that back it up do need to be rooted in this evidence, and this evidence you will have from having done your research. The next step in the essay writing process is outlining. You'll see on the right-hand side there, that's kind of like a little mock outline. You'll have sections for your introduction, for each body paragraph, and for the conclusion, and a little space to write out each element of your essay. So the introduction has a space for opening remarks, a space for your thesis, a space for a roadmap, and the body paragraphs and conclusion will have sort of the same. So just a space to make note of every different element of your essay. This is sort of like the bare bones structure of your essay. Really just allows you to get a good idea of what goes where, just using point form notes really quickly, organize your thoughts. Even if you don't actually need to do an essay outline for your assignment, you don't need to hand one in, it can be a really helpful tool for planning. You get a lot of the difficult thinking done earlier. it's a really good idea to make an outline template, kind of like what we have on the right. It can be sort of your own version of that as well, and save it to your computer and take it out and copy it and fill it in every time you write an essay. It's just a really good resource to have that makes the process go a little bit smoother. After outlining, your next step will be the draft. And if you've done your outline, this step will be easy because you've done all of your thinking ahead of time. Essentially, this step is just turning your point form notes into full sentences. And here you really want to focus on linking your ideas together, adding your transition words, and making sure everything flows together. But it's still okay if your draft is a little bit clunky and imperfect. It's really just about getting your thoughts down, getting all the important things in there, and you'll always go back to edit later on. In your draft as well, you'll want to add in your in-text citations or your footnotes, and as well, you'll create your works cited or references or bibliography. Whatever you call this does depend on the style, which your teacher will let you know. And this goes at the very end of your essay, starting on its own page, not on the same page as the end of your conclusion. Step 7 is editing. And here you'll want to read your essay through in your head and make some changes. And also, I find it really helpful to read your essay out loud to yourself or your pet, your family, your friends, anyone who will listen. I find this is a really good way to catch mistakes when you're reading out loud. And also, if something sounds a little bit too clunky or a little bit too long, you'll have an idea that it needs some changing as well, just to flow a little bit better. When you're editing, there are 3 main things to look for. The first is completion. So here you're pretty much just questioning whether you've included every single element of an essay. So everything we discussed at the beginning of this presentation, like your thesis, your topic sentences, your transitions, your citations, everything a good essay requires has been included. As well, you want to make sure that all of your statements in your body paragraphs are supported with evidence and explanations as well. Really just making sure that nothing content-wise is missing in your essay. The second category of what to look for when editing is coherence. And even if you have all the different elements of an essay in your essay, you want to make sure they're as strong and as clear as they can possibly be. So here you're judging as to whether your essay makes sense, whether your thesis makes sense, whether there's a logical flow from one argument to the next, and each body paragraph is building on what was said before in the earlier paragraphs. As well, you want to be sure that every body paragraph supports the thesis. So you might have all your statements supported with evidence and explanations, but making sure these explanations also go back to the overall argument of your essay and support that as well. And finally, when you're editing, you want to look for mechanics, things like spelling and grammar. It's pretty easy nowadays. I know all of Microsoft and the Google applications as well have tools that can help you with this, but click through your spell check and grammar check, make sure it is all good there. After you edit, you're in the home stretch. You really just want to keep editing and keep rewriting until you're satisfied with your essay. The more you read it over, the more things you will catch as well. I know a common phrase with essay writing is an essay is never really finished. It's just abandoned. There will be a point where you're either out of time or you just feel good enough about it that you're ready to submit it. When you're ready to submit, you want to make sure you include a title page. This will include things like the title of your essay, your name, the date, the teacher's name, and maybe the title or course code for your class. And the format here varies according to Style Guide. You'll want to check on that as well. Make sure you include page numbers as well, and that your pages are in the right order after printing, just so it all looks professional and so it's easy for your teacher to read and easy to mark. Generally, the essays that are easier to read, they're clearer, and that way you can have a little bit of a boost in your mark as well. So now we're just on to a few general tips about essay writing. And the first just have to do with workflow. This is something that I'm sure everyone has told you, but everyone has told you for a reason. This is the most important part, is start early and don't leave essays until the last minute. It's a lot easier when you can get a lot of your difficult thinking out of the way early on, and then you're not really pressed right before the due date. Here I recommend being really thorough and detailed from the start as well. And we've talked about this a little bit already with things like taking really detailed notes and making your citations early on while you're in the note-taking process, recording page numbers while you're reading so you don't have to go back into your book later and write them all down when you're trying to input your citations, creating an outline so your drafts go a lot quicker and smoother. And as well, if there's something about the assignment that you don't understand, definitely ask your teacher for clarification because they want you to succeed. And there is no shame in asking if you do need a few points of clarification. A few points here on essay structure and organization. You may have heard this as well, but you want to put your strongest argument last, your second strongest argument first, and your least convincing argument in the middle when you're doing your body paragraphs. This is so that when your teacher gets to the first point, you're left with a really good first impression about your argument, about your skills, about your position. It's looking really good. In the middle, you sort of want to hide your weakest argument. Not that there should be a weak argument, but maybe there's one that's a little bit less convincing than the other two. You want to put this in the middle, so maybe it's a little bit forgettable, just in case. And then your strongest argument goes last because you want to really end on a high note and blow your teacher away with how great your essay is and how convincing your arguments are. And that's what they end off remembering about your essay. As well, in terms of body paragraphs, it does depend on the class and the essay a little bit, but sometimes it is helpful to include a background paragraph before your first argumentative paragraph. This can be really handy maybe when you're writing a history essay or something else for social sciences. You're talking about a specific law or a specific policy that you just need to give a little bit more detail on, but it's too much writing to include in the introduction. A background section can be great to just sort of get your reader up to speed with everything they need to know before you go into your argument. As well, with your body paragraphs, you can be a little bit flexible with the C method. So it doesn't always have to be strictly statement, example, explanation, statement, example, explanation. You can have something like statement, example, explanation, example, explanation. Just a little bit more of an example explanation to back up one statement is totally okay. You might have something as well like statement, example, example, explanation if they both don't really need their own explanation. So you can be a little bit flexible here, as long as you're getting all your ideas down and it's still clear and coherent and you're thorough in everything you're arguing. And lastly, here we just have some general tips for formal writing. In formal writing and essay writing, it's really helpful if you know your audience, know who will be reading your essay or who is, who's intended to read your essay. Most likely it will be your teacher. So you want to write in a way that's appropriate for your teacher to read. So maybe don't write like you speak to a friend. It's just a little bit too casual and conversational. Thinking about your audience also gives you an idea about how much detail to include about background information or context or how many examples you need to put in your body paragraphs, just so it'll make sense to the reader. For example here, it's almost like if you're showing something like a meme to an older family member and you have to explain it to them so they find it funny. But if you show the same thing to maybe a sibling or a friend, they get it right away. They find it funny right away. And this is just because different people have different points of reference and they have different levels of understanding about certain subjects. So you want to keep that in mind as well as you're writing your essay. Maybe your topic isn't as familiar to your teacher as it is to you, and they would like a little bit more information. Or maybe it's just the opposite. If you're reading a novel that was assigned by the teacher and that the whole class read, you can kind of keep some of the detail down a little bit because everyone sort of knows what's going on already. You can get to the argument a little bit quicker. As well, in your essays, you don't want to write in the first person, so using I in the singular or we in the plural, or in the second person, which would be using you, either in the singular or the plural. So saying something like, I agree that, or we all know that, or you might think that, that's really just less formal, more conversational writing. And it kind of leads into our next point as well, which is that your opinions are not evidence or arguments. So try to stay away from including any of your opinions in your essays. Even if you're making an argument, which is something, a belief that you share and you want to write about, don't frame it as your own opinion. So don't write about it in the first person saying, I believe this and this and this. We want it all to come out of evidence, either from a text that you're reading in class or from the own research that you're doing. So leaving it to the experts on a certain topic. A couple final things. Here in essays, we also want to use the active voice, not the passive voice. So the active voice emphasizes the person or the thing doing the action, while the passive voice emphasizes the person or thing having the action done to them. So a quick example here, a sentence in the active voice would look like, Maria will walk the dog this afternoon. So the person or thing doing the action is Maria, and then our verb is walk. So here we really emphasize that Maria is doing the action. And the same sentence in the passive voice would look like, the dog was walked by Maria this afternoon. So here we're emphasizing the dog, who is the recipient of the action here. But it's always more professional in formal writing to use the active voice and emphasize the person who is doing the action. And one final point here about formal writing is to stay away from cliches. So phrases you sort of hear all the time, like you can't judge a book by its cover, or absence makes the heart grow fonder. Stay away from these anywhere in your essay, but especially in your thesis, really just because these aren't sort of original analytical thoughts. Now, they're cliches for a reason. Since we've heard them before, we hear them all the time. They're not really something interesting to write an essay about. So try to keep it to your own original work and not include any of these cliche phrases. And that brings us to the end of this presentation about essay writing. I hope you picked up a few helpful tips and tricks, and enjoy writing your next essay.